The MAGA coalition is slowly cracking. And what's cracking it? Foreign policy. And thanks to Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz, we're all getting a front row seat. Here they are hashing it out over the US's support of Israel's war against Iran.
We are not bombing them.
Oh, okay.
Israel is bombing them. And hey, why do you do the snide, oh, okay?
What do you mean? Because this is super high stakes stuff. This is a huge country that borders a lot of other important countries. A lot of the world's energy comes from there.
So let me
you
ask
don't
you,
want another disaster. You don't want to be
Tucker,
reckless.
the Ayatollah refers to Israel as the little Satan and America as the great Satan. Do you believe him when he says it's the great Satan?
Of course I believe
if
him.
the Ayatollah could murder both of us right now that he would? I do. I believe him.
Okay, I assume no good faith on the part of the Ayatollah.
No, not
and
good
if your
faith.
implication is like I'm pro-Ayatollah or something.
No, it's not good faith. It's that
just saying you're a lawmaker. You're a powerful person in Washington. This is the most powerful country in the world. If you're calling for toppling in government, it's incumbent on you to know something about the country and to think through the consequences of that. And you haven't, and you don't. And I'm saying that's reckless.
I haven't thought. Okay, you engage in reckless rhetoric with no facts. And to be clear,
I'm not calling for the overthrow of a government.
You put out a newsletter attacking Donald Trump and calling him complicit.
Never attacked Donald Trump.
Yes, you have. And by the way,
I campaigned for Donald Trump.
Okay, yes.
And this is after anti-Semitism, this is the last refuge. You're an anti-Semite and you hate Trump.
Okay,
I love Trump.
I will read. You put out a whole newsletter saying Trump has abandoned America first. And here's what Trump said in response. Well, considering that I'm the one that developed America first and considering that the term wasn't used until I came along, I think I'm the one who decides that. For those people who say they want peace, you can't have peace if Iran has a nuclear weapon. So for all of those wonderful people who don't want to do anything about Iran having a nuclear weapon, that's not peace. That was directed at you.
Man, you got me. Busted.
No, I'm just saying.
Look, my views. Look, I like Trump. I campaigned for Trump. I know Trump. I talked to him last night. I'm not against Trump, and you know that.
But you're against his foreign policy.
I think that we should be very careful about entering into more foreign wars that don't help us when our country is dying.
When you say
and our
don't
country
help
is
us,
dying.
Look, yes, focus on our country. I'm all for it. But the naivete.
You don't even know how much money this costs. You don't know anything about the country whose government you want to overthrow, and you're calling me reckless.
I want to stop a lunatic who wants to murder us from getting nuclear weapons that could kill millions of Americans.
Fair.
You say, I can't see how that benefits America in any way. That is bizarre. And by the way, isolationism, your foreign policy is the foreign policy of Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama.
Oh, absolutely.
And it doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm a big leftist. This is so silly. I'm Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama. Okay. Let me just say one last thing.
So how is your foreign policy different from Jimmy Carter's? Seriously.
Please.
But I asked that question seriously.
I don't even know what you're talking about. Jimmy Carter?
So
what century is this? I am the product of the last 25 years, watching carefully, being involved in the periphery, and I see an unending string of foreign policy disasters that have impoverished and hurt our country.
Unending string.
Unending string. They would include Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and our inability to stop the Houthis, by the way, in Yemen, which exposes us as weak, and I grieve over that. So these are failures. You helped preside over some of them as a member of the Senate.
What failures, foreign policy failures, have I presided over?
Well, we were unable to beat Russia in the war that you supported against Russia. You've been spending the last 3 years telling us that Vladimir Putin is evil and we're going to beat him with other people's children, and 1 million of those kids are now dead. You've never apologized for that. That was a full failure.
By the way, look, the level of number of falsehoods you lay out just in one statement are rather
You haven't supported the war against Russia?
The girls are fighting. It's all getting juicy. Now, for those of you who haven't watched the entire interview, the crux of their disagreement is this. Both argue that they believe in Trump's America First agenda, which is a hallmark of his political identity. Trump branded this as an international policy approach centered around non-interventionism abroad, whilst using the US's economic might to bend the agenda of other countries to its will, for example, through tariffs. A key part of this was Trump distancing himself from foreign policy disasters like the Iraq War, although whether or not he actually, as he claimed, was always against the Iraq War is up for debate. But America First foreign policy was a key part of Trump's insurgent campaign within the Republican Party, rebelling against the 2000s republicanism of establishment figures like Bush, McCain, and Cheney. And it gained him a huge amount of popular support amongst conservatives and independents who viewed foreign intervention as a costly experiment that ultimately took money and attention away from domestic issues. But many in the MAGA coalition feel like Trump is reneging on his platform, while others, like Ted Cruz, argue that the US is at such immediate risk of attack by Iran that supporting Israel's assault on the country is an act of self-defense. But for people like Carlson, it's all sounding a little too familiar, and not in a good way.
A lot of this has been contentious. I wish it had not, because as we started out by saying, you and I agree vehemently on 80% of the issues. This discussion is focused on the 20% where we don't. I will say, look, on Iraq, you look at the 2016 presidential campaign where you had 17 Republicans running. If you set Rand aside, and his views are on one side, there were only two candidates on that stage that opposed the Iraq war. Me and Donald Trump were the only two. Everyone else thought the Iraq war was a great thing. I think it was a disaster. So you and I agree on that as well. In my view, I think your foreign policy has gone too far. So, let me ask you, is there a military action Trump has undertaken that you agree with? Because I've not heard anything.
Look, I would say it's really simple. I believe in self-defense. That's why I keep firearms at home. I think it's morally justified to defend yourself, your family, your property, your nation. And so to the extent that you can deter a threat through violence always being the least appealing choice, violence always being, if I can finish, always being a tragedy, I think you can justify the use of violence in self-defense. That is my personal view. And that applies to me and to the country that I live in. Those are my views. That's not an isolationist view. It's not an anti-Israel view. It's not an anti-Semitic view, with apologies. It is, I think, a pretty common sense view. But my problem is that lawmakers in Washington are light on detail with these things, and they speak, as you do, entirely in moral terms. These people are bad. These people are...
I'm not speaking entirely in moral terms. I'm not interested in killing bad guys. I'm interested in killing people who are trying to kill us.
If we had...
That's different. I'm not engaged in morality.
Are you now? Because you told me that the government of Iran is presently trying to assassinate Donald Trump. And then you
that
said...
is undisputed. There's literally nobody who disputes that fact.
Then why don't you support military action right now against Iran?
We are engaged in military action right now.
Why don't you support offensive military action?
We're bombing the crap out of them. Israel is, and we're supporting them. Israel is.
Okay. So why shouldn't the U.S. military defend its own president? I don't understand that.
Look. And it goes back to...
Because you don't really believe it's true, that's why.
Nobody disputes it, Tucker. Did we land on the moon? What other conspiracies do you not believe? Was 9/11 an inside job? What?
So I've asked you the names of these people. I don't
know the names of the Iranian hitmen. I know it because the U.S. military and the intelligence agencies have testified before Congress repeatedly.
And what did they say?
That Iran is trying to murder Donald Trump and has hired hitmen. Do I know the name of the hitmen? No, I'm sorry. And I don't think we do either, because we would apprehend them if we knew their names.
Then why don't you take it seriously enough to support killing the Ayatollah in response to protect our president? But you don't. This doesn't even make any sense. And you're calling me an isolationist. If I believed that was true, I would support military action against the government of Iran.
So if you, like me, are having manufacturing consent PTSD, you're not alone. Right before the Iraq War, we were also told a country that most people famously couldn't find on a map was an imminent threat of invading the West. We heard the fear-mongering about Iraqi mushroom clouds and the weapons that could be deployed within 45 minutes. And much like now, the evidence on that was pretty thin. And based on that thin evidence, an already precarious region was plunged into chaos and instability that we are still bearing the consequences of. So that might be why vague insinuations about dossiers and briefings and assassination plots might not be hitting like they did in 2003, especially because Israel has been openly desperate to drag the US into a war with Iran for decades. And it has been using this idea that Iran is on the brink of developing nuclear weapons that entire time. In fact, way back in a 1992 speech to the Knesset, Benjamin Netanyahu himself said this: "Within 3 to 5 years, we can assume that Iran will become autonomous in its ability to develop and produce a nuclear bomb." So that was 30 years ago. He repeated that 3 years later in 1995 with the same time frame in his book, Fighting Terrorism. Here he is in 2012 at the UN General Assembly, showing an illustration of how close Iran is to developing nuclear weapons. But the parallels between Iran and Iraq are not even just in rhetoric. At the same time as the US was ramping up the war propaganda machine on Iraq, Netanyahu was actively pushing for this to include war on Iran. Here he is testifying to the US Congress in 2002.
Obviously, we like to see a regime change, at least I would, in Iran, just as I would like to see in Iraq. The question now is a practical question. What is the best place to proceed? It's not a question of whether Iraq's regime should be taken out, but when should it be taken out? It's not a question of whether you'd like to see a regime change in Iran, but how to achieve it. If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. The more victories you amass, the easier the next victory becomes. The first victory in Afghanistan makes the second victory in Iraq that much easier. The second victory in Iraq will make the third victory that much easier too, but it may change the nature of achieving that victory. It may be possible to have implosions taking place. I don't guarantee it, Mr. Turney, but I think it makes it more likely, and therefore I think the choice of Iraq is a good choice. It's the right choice. There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No question whatsoever. And there is no question that once he acquires it, history shifts immediately.
Success after success. That really sounds like the story of the Middle East over the past 20 years, right, Kieran?
I mean, listening to Benjamin obviously nothing that comes out of that man's mouth surprises me at all. But mark my words, he said, I guarantee it. I think we ought to know what we can have in compensation for that guarantee. It's astonishing how many times that man, and I don't want to just personalize it, this is much bigger than him, obviously, but he is obviously an utterly instrumental figure in all of this. How many times someone in professional life could lie with massive, violent, deadly consequences and fail upwards. I mean, remember that not only has Netanyahu said over and over again insane things about, regime change in Iraq and in Iran and so on. He also, and I think this is an aside, but I think it's relevant. He also said to those that remember about 10 years ago to the German chancellor, I believe it was. Actually, I'm not sure about that. I should have checked. But he basically said that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, was the one who planted the idea for the Holocaust in Adolf Hitler's head, essentially exculpating Hitler for the final solution. This is a man who will stop at nothing, absolutely nothing. He respects no form of truth. He is lies all the way through to achieve his own personal political ends. On Ted Cruz. This is somebody who is so cucked by Israel. And in another part of that interview, I encourage everybody to watch it. It's a very, very engaging 2 hours. It's a long interview. You can certainly skip parts, but the really meaty parts, they're worth your time. He is grilled by Tucker Carlson for some time about his relationship with AIPAC, right, the American-Israeli Joint Partnership. And he talks about how he's received lots and lots of money from AIPAC. And Tucker Carlson grills him on that relationship. And he goes on to talk about how his relationship with Israel is rooted in the nation of Israel as referenced in the Bible. In the end, we know it's about money, but he's trying to burnish with a kind of celestial light his desire, his very earthly desire for blood money. And what I take from that clip where he's squirming, talking about alleged plots to assassinate Donald Trump by Iranians, is that Ted Cruz, which comes from Netanyahu, by the way, that claim comes from Netanyahu. He's so cucked by Israel and he's so in the pocket of the Israelis and Netanyahu specifically and personally that he's willing to utterly humiliate himself on international television. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, the levels of masochism he seems willing to go to simply to please his Israeli masters and Netanyahu first among them. Tucker Carlson, I mean, maybe we'll talk more about this in a moment, Dahlia, but you have to wonder what his motives are. I believe him that he has a strong distaste for bombing Iran. I agree with him entirely when he says that the central problem in all of this is lawmakers who are willing to fight to the last drop of other people's blood and who are totally light on the details. Light on the details was the phrase that Tucker Carlson used, and he's right. In another part of the interview, Tucker Carlson can't tell his audience, Ted Cruz can't tell Tucker Carlson's audience how many millions of people live in Iran. It really is very risible. And it speaks to, as you've alluded to, Dahlia, a much wider and more interesting split, we hope widening split, down the middle of the mega base around those who are nativists and isolationists first and foremost and stick to that, and those who are basically, to use a theological phrase since Ted Cruz wanted to, antinomian Trumpists. Antinomianism, the idea that you can sin in religion. You can sin as long as you redeem yourself spiritually by practicing other forms of Christianity and Christian dogmatism and so on. So antinomian Trumpists, people who literally say, if Trump does it, it's okay. It's okay if Trump does it. It's okay if he goes back on his word. It's okay if he becomes an interventionist in foreign military adventures. As long as it's Trump, it's Trumpism, and I'm fine with that. So for me, that's the kind of central, that's the core schism.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about what might be behind Tucker Carlson's position. But before we do, there's two more clips from that interview between Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz that I actually found particularly disturbing and want to show you. And it's about why Ted Cruz is such a vehement supporter of Israel, including by potentially following Israel into a war with Iran.
Growing up in Sunday school, I was taught from the Bible, those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And from my perspective, I want to be on the blessing side of things.
Of those who bless the government of Israel?
Those who bless Israel is what it says. It doesn't say the government of it, it says the nation of Israel. So that's in the Bible. As a Christian, I believe that.
Where is that?
I can find it to you. I don't have the scripture off the tip of my... You pull out the phone and use the Google.
It's in Genesis. But so you're quoting a Bible phrase. You don't have context for it. And you don't know where in the Bible it is, but that's like your theology? I'm confused. What does that even mean?
Tucker.
I'm a Christian. I want to know what you're talking about.
Okay. Where does my support for Israel come from? Number one, because biblically we're commanded to support Israel. But number two...
Hold on.
I'm not holding on.
Hold on. You're a senator, and now you're throwing out theology, and I am a Christian, and I am allowed to weigh in on this. We are commanded as Christians to support the government of Israel?
We are commanded to support Israel. And what
does that mean, Israel?
We're told those who bless Israel will be blessed.
I mean, that is shocking. That is shocking. I mean, they go on to have this little argument about whether the Israel that was referred to in the Bible is the same thing as the political entity that is now Israel, that we call Israel today, and where in Genesis it says it. I don't care where in Genesis it says. I don't care if the Israel that they talk about in the Bible is the Israel that they're talking about in, modern day political context. You don't conduct, when you conduct wars, potentially illegal wars, potentially without going through democratic processes, because your God told you to, that's a theocracy. And I'm particularly alarmed by that when you consider that elsewhere in that interview, they talk about, the problem in the Middle East is radical Islamists being in power, radical Islamists, these religious fanatics. is it not religious fanaticism to say I'm going to throw the entire world into danger because a line in my holy book, I've interpreted that line in my holy book has told me that I should? I mean, it's the idea that those who bless Israel will be blessed, that is a governing principle of a real war with real weapons and real human lives. I mean, it's unbelievable. And what it reminds me of, if we're talking again about the parallels between Iran and Iraq, the war that they're trying to drum up support for now in Iran and the war that happened in Iraq, you might also remember that's also what Bush said. Bush told us that God told him to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. But what is also quite interesting about this and what surfaces in this interview is, on the one hand, Cruz is saying he has this like God-ordained fixation on defending Israel. It is divine for him. It's theological. But then he claims that those who criticize the state of Israel, as in the real existing state of Israel and the real existing things that are happening, are somehow unhealthily obsessed with it.
If you're not an anti-Semite, give me another reason why the obsession is Israel.
I am in no sense obsessed with Israel. We are on the brink of war with Iran. And so these are valid questions.
But you're not asking about Iran or the
If I can
Ayatollah.
finish, you asked me why I'm obsessed with Israel.
Yep.
3 minutes after telling me that when you first ran for Congress, you elucidated one of your main goals, which is to defend Israel.
Yes.
And I'm the one who's obsessed with Israel. I don't see a lawmaker's job as defending the interests of a foreign government, period. Okay. Any government, including the ones that my ancestors come from. So that's my position. That does not make me an anti-Semite. And shame on you for suggesting otherwise. And I mean that. And that's low, and you know it's low. So why don't you just answer my questions in a straightforward, rational way? You certainly have the IQ to do it.
So shame on you is cute, by the way, Tucker.
It is. It's not cute. I'm offended. I'm obsessed with the Jews. You just told me
you just called me a sleazy feline.
It is sleazy to imply that I'm an anti-Semite for asking questions about how my government is run.
You want to count how many questions you asked about? What about the Jews? What about Israel? What about AIPAC?
I never asked about the Jews. This has nothing to do with the Jews, whatever.
Shame on you now. That's cute. He's been watching a little bit of Drag Race, hasn't he? Now, I think it's important to clarify here that Tucker Carlson has reported on and given a lot of airtime to what I and many others would consider anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, but these are nothing to do with his stance on Israel. Rather, they include things like the Great Replacement theory, which implies that Jewish people in powerful positions have encouraged immigration in the West to try and replace white people in exchange for their votes. A theory which, by the way, many in the Republican Party, including the most fervent Zionists who are ready to accuse anyone else of anti-Semitism, they have flirted with that theory in some capacity. Even if they haven't outright named Jewish people, they instead will use euphemisms like cultural Marxists. On a separate note, Ted Cruz wrote an entire book on how cultural Marxists are destroying America. Make of that what you will. Still, we touched on this a little bit earlier on, but when it comes to Tucker Carlson's criticism of the US's undying support of a state that is at plausible risk of genocide and now creating existential problems for an already unstable region, that is an entirely valid reason. It's a concern that many of us share. But I don't think it's a position that comes from, I'm almost certain it's not a position that comes from any kind of anti-racist solidarity with Palestinians. Tucker Carlson's entire brand is staked in highly inflammatory anti-immigration fear-mongering. He once said that immigration is making America dirtier and poorer. And his Fox News show has been described as the most racist show in the history of cable news. I think this is really, it's a protectionist position. It's a position of saying, every dollar should be spent on looking after our own and to hell with the rest of the world. Now, at the moment, that is translating to an anti-war stance that is, overall a very good one. But I don't think it doesn't emerge from a kind of moral standpoint in the way that perhaps Kieran, your and I's position on Palestine emerges from. Kieran, should we be a little bit wary of how we position ourselves in what is being described as this civil war within MAGA?
We should definitely be wary. And I think you make a really good point, Dahlia. It's not about morals. There's another bit in that interview where Ted Cruz says, international norms, what are they? I've never seen one. I don't know what they are. I'm interested in American interests. And Tucker Carlson completely agrees with him. And actually, if by some surreal hallucination we had Tucker Carlson on this show, he would probably completely agree with you. He would say, yeah, I'm open about that. It's about American interests. I'm a nativist and I'm an isolationist. That's what he'd say. So American interests. And his view is getting entangled in foreign conflicts all the time is not in America's interests, based on empirical evidence, based on the wars. And he listed some of them to Ted Cruz over the past 20, 30 years. But there are gradients within MAGA, right? So if you listen to Joe Rogan talk about this, again, Joe Rogan, somebody with whom I seldom like to break bread. I mean, Joe Rogan also has some really disquieting, problematic views on certain things and definitely tends toward the conspiratorial in ways that I think isn't helpful a lot of the time and punches down. Nonetheless, if you listen to Joe Rogan and Dave Smith, the libertarian guy who famously butted heads with Douglas Murray, they do talk about morality. They do say, yeah, this is about American interests and American soldiers and so on. But it's also about Palestinians. You know, we don't like this shit happening to people in other countries. I don't know if they consider themselves MAGA, but they definitely voted. I'm very confident they voted for Donald Trump. I mean, Joe Rogan certainly did. I'm pretty confident Dave Smith did as well. And they broadly support Trump on a lot of issues. But they pull no punches on this stuff when it comes to Israel and when it comes to centralizing some element of morality alongside the national interest stuff. Joe Rogan, Ted Cruz, much less so. Tucker Carlson, much less so. But so I think there are gradients within MAGA. On Ted Cruz, final thing, this isn't actually new, using the nation of Israel stuff, talking about Israel in biblical terms. It's kind of, actually Mitt Romney used it in 2012 when he was running to be president against Obama in what would become Obama's second term. So during the 2012 presidential election campaign, he said several times that Israel, kind of vague comments, but you know what he was getting at, that Israel is dispensed as a nation by providence to stand above other nations. It's kind of primus inter pares nation, a first among equals. And he invoked, obviously he's a Mormon, but he invoked his own holy scripture in reference to that. But I come back to the point, Dahlia, and I'm glad we played the clip. We should see straight through it with Ted Cruz and with Mitt Romney. I don't think they believe it. I don't think Ted Cruz believes it. I'm sure he tells himself that he believes it. I'm sure he tries to convince himself that he does. But it's about money. And if the money dried up, if the apex support and the money dried up and the geostrategic situation shifted, and, even if this mega split happens and it convinces Trump to pull away from Israel, he'll quickly change his tune. It's about money. It's not greed is good even. It's greed is God.